What does forgive us our trespasses really mean? Find out today on the Faithful and True podcast. Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host. I'm here today again with Dr. Greg Miller, our host. Greg, how are you today?
I'm doing well.
And as we promised last week, we're going to do part 2 of our conversation with Debbie Laaser and Beth Miller, both from, Debbie is our director, of course, and Beth is the wife of Greg and one of our favorite counselors here at Faithful and True. We'd like to thank everyone who's been watching us on our YouTube channel, the Faithful and True channel. We invite you to continue the process by subscribing to our channel and liking us. That helps us out a lot as we are trying to continue to promote and spread our message of hope to all those that are trying to heal from their challenges with the subject of sexual behavior. Today we're going to continue our conversation about forgiveness.
Yes. And if you were with us last week, you know that we began by talking specifically about what does forgiveness look like in a relationship where there's been betrayal. And we want to just continue that and look kind of at that principle of the relationship between ownership and forgiveness. And I made reference to the model prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And I don't think it's an accident that what's mentioned first is that need to look at ourselves and to own the way that we have hurt others before we look at how they've hurt us and what that looks like in relationship. So as we just kind of talk about ownership and begin at that place, how would you define ownership for someone who is listening?
Well, I think very simply, ownership is just when you acknowledge that you did or said something that hurt another person. And so it can be something very small and it can be something very big. But ownership, again, it's the reverse of blaming someone else. Mm-hmm. And it starts with just acknowledging and speaking very directly, like I'm sorry that I said this to you. I think you took it the wrong way, or I'm sorry that I didn't follow through on something that I promised you I would do, or it starts getting as big as, being unfaithful in the relationship, like we talked about in our last podcast.
I also would add that I think it's really important that when we're owning, we're not explaining it away. Mm-hmm. If I say to you, I own that I was snarky, but it was because you and then like, you just totally really crossed out and invalidated the ownership. So it's a standalone, mm-hmm. right? Like, it's just out there, and it's vulnerable. I own that I did this, and I'm sorry.
And I do think it is complicated because, you were talking, Deb, about this idea of I'm sorry, I hurt you. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we immediately go to, well, that wasn't my intent. Right. And so we want to kind of put on the other person that it's their responsibility, they were hurt, because that's not what I intended. Mm-hmm. And so even just being able to be free to own our actions and allow the other person to have whatever reaction it is, so that we're not blaming them for being mm-hmm. hurt by something that we did. We just own that, yes, I did that. Mm-hmm. I do think it's complicated at times.
Yeah. I love in Harriet Lerner's book, Why Won't You Apologize? She talks about this idea that it takes a solid sense of self to just own mm-hmm. and apologize. And I find that to be true. It's vulnerable and is risky, and it does take our wise adult selves, as we talk about here in Faithful mm-hmm. and True, to do that. Mm-hmm.
And when you say it's vulnerable, it is, because when you share something like that, the response you get from an unsafe person might be damaging in and of itself. Well, you do that all the time. Mm-hmm. And, right. So you want to apologize for the other 100 times you did that in the last month, or, the response can be rather harsh and can be turned against you, which is, I think, why some people are reluctant to start owning more than they right. do, depending on how safe their relationship right. is.
And this ownership piece is so central to emotional and spiritual health, because one, I can't take responsibility for something that I don't own. And it's that principle I talk about, stewardship begins with ownership.
Right.
So if I want to be a good steward of my life, I have to own my life. If I want to steward my choices, I have to own my choices. But there is this vulnerability that comes if I'm afraid I'm going to be attacked, or maybe I don't like the way I see myself in that ownership, and my fear is that other people will reject me. And so I love that idea of I've got to be in that strong sense of self,
Right.
even to begin that idea of ownership.
I think also, ideally, we will be in a place where we want to change what we did to hurt someone.
Right.
So, more than just saying the words of ownership or apology, it will ideally lead to changing something in our
Yes.
life. If we're apologizing for screaming at our children, let's just say, and we have to do it again tomorrow because we screamed again, and then next week because we screamed again. In some ways, our words become worthless and cheap.
Right.
And so, I think even biblically, we're encouraged not just to speak our truth, but to live our truth. And so, ideally, this is leading us to become a better person. When we own and we change, we start putting in better character qualities into the person we are.
Well, and in our last podcast, we began kind of acknowledging that how we experience this ownership, forgiveness piece growing up will impact how we perceive it now. So, how would you encourage someone to kind of even explore what did ownership and forgiveness look like in my family when I was a child?
Well, if I were to look at my own, I think, as you said in the last podcast, we really didn't talk about, specifically, you need to say you're sorry to somebody for doing whatever, or did we hear that a lot? It was a calm and safe and peaceful family, but we didn't talk about those things. And I think the reverse of that can be where people in a family are asking for forgiveness all the time. I was working with a client recently, and I know she was saying that, when she yelled at her children, she immediately asked them to forgive her. And the truth is, she continues to struggle with that reaction with her kids, that irritable reaction of raging with them. So, again, I sometimes wonder if asking someone when you've done something but it isn't changing, whether that's a good idea,
Right.
In terms of
Right.
what you're teaching them. And
Yeah.
what was your experience, Beth?
Well, I like this thought that you're bringing to the table of there's a difference between ownership and asking for forgiveness. It almost feels like I'm putting someone on the spot, right?
Yeah.
If I can own it and then immediately say, "Will you forgive me?" I think there's goodness to just owning it, right?
And then stop.
And stopping,
Yeah,
right?
I think so
Right.
too.
I had an experience when I was growing up where I was actually traveling with another family. I was 15. They were a family in our church, and I was riding with them for about an 8-hour car ride. And it was a husband and wife and 2 young children and me. And the wife said something kind of snarky to her husband, and just let it hang out there for a little bit. And it got quiet in the car. Nobody said much, but then we kind of started trying to move around that. And about 20 minutes later, she just said in front of all of us, turned to her husband and said, "Hey, I need to own that was really inappropriate, what I said to you 10 miles ago, and I'm sorry." I was jaw dropped in the back seat because we didn't talk that openly in my home. It wasn't that there was lots of yelling or screaming, but that open ownership, "Hey, what I just said was hurtful," or "Hey, what I just did was insensitive or rude." That wasn't my experience, and the openness of that was so moving to me.
Isn't it interesting that at our couples workshops, we often survey them, don't we, at some point, and we ask them, in your growing up families, how many of you experienced much ownership and from the adults? And it's almost 95%, I would say, that say they never heard ownership from parents, which I just find amazing. We're talking about primarily Christian families that we're working with. And so, to your point, I don't think there's a lot of modeling in what it looks like to actually own.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's a false belief that we have as adults that if I ask for forgiveness or own something for my children, I'm diminishing my power and my authority. And so I don't ever want to appear weak. I don't ever want to appear vulnerable. And again, the great reality is when I own and ask for forgiveness, then actually I am being more powerful because I'm in my truth. Truth is always empowering, even difficult or painful truth. And so we have to begin to change our mindset. And when I'm talking to people about parenting, I often say, whatever you want your kids to do, model it. So if you want your children to forget or to apologize, you model apologizing. If you want your children to own something, you model ownership. And that's when you begin to make the shift. But if it wasn't modeled for us, it really is like learning a brand new language that we have to speak in the context of our families.
Yeah, my client this week, when we were talking about ownership and how to come back from a real out-and-out argument she and her husband were having, I said, is there anything you can think of at all that you could own? Because what we know is if either one of you can bring a piece of ownership, generally speaking, it will break that struggle that's going on, and it will soften the environment, make it safer. She goes, that is such a foreign concept to me. I don't even know what you're talking about. And she was honest about that. And a really faith-filled woman, love her to pieces, but, she clearly really didn't know what we were talking about.
Well, and I like that principle that ownership creates safety.
Yeah.
If I'm in a relationship, whether it's my kids, my spouse, friends, whatever it is, when I start owning stuff, or maybe they own something, immediately it is safer because we are now in the context of truth. We've gotten out of that blame, shame. And what may be true is for couples specifically, where there's this dynamic of, one is typically the one who blames, one typically is the one who goes into shame. That blame, shame dance keeps you out of that truth and ownership. And ownership is what gets us out of that dance. Even, like you said, the slightest thing, the smallest thing can begin to change that dynamic. One thing is we're talking about this, I want to go back to something that we kind of slid in, this idea of asking someone to forgive you. I know in the early days of my recovery, I was specifically encouraged not to do that I was to own my stuff, to take responsibility for it, and I wasn't to come back and say, will you forgive me? And I like that idea of creating the space for the other person to get to decide that.
Yes.
And maybe you're working with someone who has a strong enough sense of self that would say, no, I'm not ready. But in most cases, out of some sort of obligation or the moment we say, yes, I will, but we're not quite ready. So how would you coach someone around this idea of asking to be forgiven in the moment?
Well, I think it goes to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, that you own, you apologize, and you leave it there. If I don't think it's wrong to say something like, at some point, I hope you'll be able to forgive me. That is a desire, of your heart in that situation. That makes sense. But I do think that what you just said is absolutely true. I think to ask in the moment, especially when there's so many emotions and, hurt feelings or whatever, I think it puts someone on the spot. And out of obligation, that's usually where the answer comes.
Ditto.
What she said.
What she said, yeah. And maybe it was my upbringing too. And in my church upbringing, I was never encouraged to ask for forgiveness. So it's foreign to me. So I don't.
I never did anything wrong. So that I was one of those. One of those. Why ask for forgiveness when you're such a perfect kid?
Well, and for those of us who grew up in the church, we know the correct answer is yes, I will forgive you. That's true. We know that forgiveness is a part of the dynamic of healthy, functioning relationships. The problem is it's in that moment, and it's kind of like what we talked about on the previous podcast. It is a process. It is a journey. It comes out of an awareness and the truth. And in that space, we can begin to move towards a journey of forgiveness rather than just in that moment on the spot, agreeing to something. It's kind of like signing a contract without reading it first. We need to see what we're signing up for. And yes, we are open to that process of forgiveness, but that doesn't mean I'm ready to forgive you in this moment.
Well, I think one of the big reasons that sometimes we ask will you forgive me, is less about forgiveness and more about fear of disconnection. And so I think we are driven by this energy to ask that in hopes that we can get the connection back, because we
Right.
don't know how to hold space for another person a lot of times to be angry or hurt. And it tends to create
Anxiety.
that
you say.
absolutely
Yeah.
an anxiety that we want to hustle for that quick connection again.
And so even that's interesting. If we're one of those people that wants to quickly ask for forgiveness, maybe there's some work for us to do in living with the discomfort of having the perception that we may not connect again over this, or that someone is going to be angry with us for a time, or sad or disappointment. And how can we deal with that in a healthy way? So there's always something we're learning when we slow down a process, isn't it? And don't make it black and white. So I think at Faithful and True, we're all pretty much on the same page that forgiveness is a slower process than maybe many of us have been taught or want to make it, because it's so much easier to make it black and white. We do this and we move on and we don't have to think about it or feel it. And that's not really what we're encouraging people to work on.
Greg and I live in Chicago in a condo, and we have several other neighbors in our building. And several months ago, our downstairs neighbor slid a note under our door. It was right at the beginning of the High Holy Days. He's a very devout Jew, and it was right towards Rosh Hashanah beginning. And so this note said, in a couple of days, I just want to give you this awareness that you'll hear the shofar or the ram's horn. And I blow the horn to invite me to slow down and take 10 days to consider, where have I wandered from God and where do I need to ask repentance? So on the Sunday afternoon when the horn blew, it was really beautiful. It was sacred. At first I was inclined to just keep doing what I was doing, but it really, like, we both just stopped and listened. And isn't that a beautiful visual image of calling all of us to stop and consider, slow down, where have I trespassed, right, against someone?
Well, and it's that invitation of reflection. It's that invitation to consider. And what's true is when we are busy, when we are just moving through life, we're not conscious of how we've hurt others. We can be awkward and stumbly. It's kind of like moving through the airport with a big suitcase and you're just banging people, but you don't know it because you keep plowing forward. And it that lack of self-awareness of how my choices, my actions, my reactions may have been hurtful for somebody else. In a perfect world, we would live in this space where we move towards others and say, hey, I want to own how I've hurt you, versus them needing to come to us and say, hey, this is how you've hurt me. But we don't live in that perfect world. And so when someone moves towards us to say, hey, this is something you did that hurts me, it's how we respond in that moment that talks about this ownership piece. It's that responsibility for how we've trespassed into somebody else's space.
I just think, too, when we're working with women especially who have been very hurt, and we're encouraging them at some point in their journey to begin looking at these things, is just a reminder this is not about identifying you as a bad person or being at fault for something else that's gone on, but an encouragement to grow in their own likeness of Christ and to become all that they can become. Because I think in that ownership place, again, we're examining those places of ourselves that we want to try to change. And when we work on that change, I think that's when we begin to love ourselves more.
Right.
I don't think that was the right word. Ourself more.
Ourselves.
That's a new word I just made up.
Yeah. We all knew what you
My
meant.
English teacher but we're encouraged to just examine ourselves more, to become more of the person God created us to be. And in that place is a lot more peace and joy and goodness and gentleness. And that's a place we're trying to move to, I think, in our development.
Well, and we kind of talked about this in the last podcast, but over ownership is just as chaotic as under ownership. And so one of the images that I use in relationship is kind of like I have a box of stuff. The other person I'm in relationship has a box of stuff, and we dump it on a table, and then it gets all mixed up. And then what we try to do and what we need to do is whatever is ours, we take back off the table. And what becomes chaotic is if we try to take somebody else's that doesn't belong to us, or we leave stuff on the table that belongs to us, that creates chaos. And if we're in relationship with someone who doesn't do ownership well, what may happen is there's some stuff that's left on the table that creates chaos for us, but it doesn't serve the relationship for me to pull it off. I mean, just trying to live in that chaos of nobody's owning that, and it's not mine, and so I'm not going to take responsibility for it.
And it's probably the case that in those relationships, because there's generally balance, when there's too much ownership from one person, there's not enough for the other person.
Because the table gets clean.
I mean, my guess is the other person is pushing those things to you.
Right.
And you're confused in the beginning about, well, do they belong to me or not? He says they do, and maybe they do. And sorting that out with the help of other healthy people, I think, in your life is part of the process.
Right. Especially working with couples where there's been addiction. One of the things that we talk to the men about is that you are completely responsible for your addiction and your behavior, that is totally yours, that there is no responsibility that your wife has. It's the thing that you'll talk about at the women's workshop. You can't control it, you can't cure it, you're not responsible for it, so just kind of be free from that. But like you said, if I have a husband that's telling me it's my fault, that may be, confusing. But if the husband is fully owning the addiction, then what is left on the table that they have each contributed to the coupleship, then we can begin to get clear about what is mine, what's not mine.
Yeah. And you know what I'd love to add is actually this whole idea of ownership and whatever has nothing to do with addiction.
Right.
I mean, ideally, we're all working on this.
That's right.
Whether we have sex addiction in our relationship or not, or we have other kinds of addiction or coping. It's just a process in our spiritual life. To deal with looking at what belongs to us from the table and to acknowledge it and hopefully change it.
Right. Well, and self-righteousness is the alternative to ownership.
Yeah.
It's a spiritualized version. And the way that I define self-righteousness, it occurs when I have this laundry list of all the things I've not done versus looking at the things that I did do. And so it's that shift to say, I'm going to focus on the choices I've made. I'm going to take responsibility for my life, versus trying to find my value and worth by reminding people how good I am because I didn't do these things. And that can be in the context of any relationship that we can struggle with that.
Right.
Well, as I used to say to Mark, when Mark and I were doing the podcast, we've reached that point in the podcast where how would you like to wrap up this 2 podcast series on forgiveness? Is there a closing thought that you'd like our listeners to embrace?
I love the idea of liminal space, and it's this idea of where I enter into I'm not where I was nor where I want to be just yet, but in the liminal space is where the transformation happens. And I think that's what forgiveness is, that it changes us. And if we're not really changed as we're forgiving or seeking, to ask someone, we're, owning what we've done, if that doesn't really change us, it's probably not authentic. Hopefully we are being changed into becoming the emotionally and spiritually wise people that we are called to be.
Are you going to ditto that again?
I would
Okay.
I would just say maybe in just a couple of words. I like who I am more, and I feel more connected to God, and I feel more connected to my relationships. They're safer, they're gentler, we feel closer, and definitely the more ownership there is, the better all of that's working in my life. So.
And my final comment would be the image of forgiveness for me is releasing. That it's like this weight that I am carrying, this unforgiveness does weigh me down. And to have the capacity to forgive is able to release that weight. And it's not dependent upon the other person. That's the beauty of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not dependent upon the other person. It's my willingness to surrender to this process.
You've all done a great job of wrapping that up for us. You've been listening to the Faithful and True podcast. We're so grateful that you joined us today. We hope that you're enjoying our new efforts on YouTube with the Faithful and True channel. Again, we extend the invitation to subscribe to our channel and to like us. We appreciate that we have growing numbers and a growing audience out there that are so loyal, and for that we are blessed. I'm very, very appreciative of that. We hope that if you get the chance, or if you have identified that you are a man that's struggling with these issues and you'd like to reach out to Faithful and True, our 3-day intensive Men of Valor workshop we offer every month. And Greg leads like no other in that effort, and we would love to be able to help you in your healing journey as well. Until we join you next week, we'd like to thank you. We hope that this coming week for you is going to be a week that's just filled with many blessings and great vision.